Have our next session that will start immediately here on America in the Middle East. And there's Ilan. And over to you.
Thanks, Andrea. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. That was a great session. I was fascinated listening to that. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. I think what we're going to do today is talk for a little while, or at least I am, about what a sustainable U.S. approach to the Middle East could look like. The Biden administration came in focused on the Indo-Pacific, COVID-19, the economy, rebuilding relationships with our allies. The reality is the Middle East is not really a central priority for the incoming administration, nor should it be. But it also hasn't been a central priority for the last 3 incoming administrations. And each time we've gotten sucked back in, and it's taken up a remarkable amount of time. So some people say that that's because you can't avoid the Middle East. It will suck you back in no matter what, even if you try and leave it. I disagree. I don't think that's actually true. I think it's actually a function of bad American policy, what I call the American yo-yo diet in the Middle East. And so there it is, the American yo-yo diet. So, if we were smarter about the Middle East, we could manage our very real interests in the region while avoid getting drawn into the region in an unhealthy way, right? So let me try to explain what the yo-yo diet is. It's basically a phenomenon where for the past 20 years, we've been trying to leave the Middle East. We go on a crash diet to get out. Everything collapses and implodes, and then we come binging back in. And it goes back a number of administrations. George W. Bush comes in, and his whole campaign was, at least the foreign policy piece, was about not being the policeman of the world, stopping with these small wars and focusing on Russia and China. I don't know if that sounds familiar. But then just months into his presidency, we have the 9/11 attacks, and his entire presidency is sucked up by Iraq and Afghanistan. And this was at least partially a problem with American policy. I mean, I don't know if things would have been different if there'd been an earlier focus on al-Qaeda in the beginning of the Bush administration or not. And it wasn't the only reason, but it is true that this was not seen as a priority coming in, and that probably had at least some impact on the decisions made in those early months. So then Barack Obama comes in, and Barack Obama says, we've gotten too sucked in by Iraq, we need to withdraw. And that's what he campaigns on. It's a centerpiece of his campaign. And eventually we do withdraw from Iraq. We pivot to Asia. And just a couple years later, ISIS emerges and the Obama administration gets sucked back in. And again, I think ISIS might have emerged no matter what, but the fact that we went to 0 troops in Iraq meant that we really had no understanding or warning, didn't see this coming early enough, and had a much worse problem on our hands when we did have to engage on it. And it's not as though we put thousands of troops back into the Middle East. We actually, the numbers were somewhat limited, but the amount of senior leadership time that this issue sucked up during the later years of the Obama administration was more than any other foreign policy issue. So again, basically crash diet followed by a binge. And now Donald Trump basically did the same thing. He comes in saying he wants to get out of the wars in the Middle East. And we have the 2018 National Defense Strategy, which really puts great power competition at the center. But then we have this Iran policy, which is highly escalatory, leads to significant escalation with Iran, culminating in the killing of IRGC Quds Force leader Qasem Soleimani and Iranian missile attacks on U.S. bases. And by the end of the Trump administration, again, U.S. forces in the Middle East are higher than they were at the beginning of the Trump administration, with a very significant level. And now it's early in the Biden administration. It's unclear if they're going to be able to avoid this mistake again. But you did get a little bit of a taste for it a few weeks ago, right? Where, again, the administration was very clear about the Israeli-Palestinian issue not being a priority. They weren't going to get sucked into that issue the way previous administrations did. But you had this conflict between Israel and Hamas, sucked up, again, a lot of the president's time and a lot of his national security team's time for a week there. I think they handled the conflict itself pretty well. But again, you have to wonder if there had been a little more focus earlier, especially when things were bubbling in Jerusalem in the weeks before, perhaps we could have headed off the conflict in the first place. So what do we need to do? Basically, we need to get away from this yo-yo diet and move towards what I call a healthy, sustainable approach to the Middle East, right? I mean, this is what we need. What we really need is a square diet for the Middle East when it comes to U.S. foreign policy. I mean, the Biden team was right that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict should not be at the centerpiece of its U.S. policy. that the Secretary of State, as the saying goes, should not be the action officer for the Middle East peace process. But the question is, we need enough engagement in the region and the right kind of engagement to keep the situation under control, to manage what are very real interests for the United States, and again, not to necessarily solve all the problems, but at least to make sure that they don't start to threaten core U.S. national security interests. So what does that look like? Let's start by looking at what our interests actually are. And I would argue we have three central interests when it comes to the Middle East. The first is defending the U.S. homeland and American citizens and key allies from terror attacks. Now, some people will say, well, look, more people die falling in the shower than die from terrorist attacks, so maybe this isn't as important as it's made out to be. Look, that's true to some extent, but the reality is terror attacks have this disproportionate impact on American domestic politics, on our society as a whole, and how we respond. And so if we can invest properly in trying to avoid the worst of these, you're not going to avoid everything, but avoid, especially large-scale attacks against the U.S. and Europe and other key allies, it's going to make a huge difference. And I think that is something that we can do without expending too much capital. Second is stopping the spread of nuclear weapons in the region. And that starts with Iran, but it also is the potential responses from Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and other players. And here, I think the bottom line is the nuclear weapons are still the world's most dangerous weapons. And the Middle East is still one of the world's most unstable regions. And so that needs to remain a priority to keep these weapons out of this region. And the third core interest is preserving freedom of navigation in the region. And here, what I would say is, traditionally this has meant preserving oil supplies. I think that actually matters less, both because, U.S. Production has gone up in recent years. We're more independent. On top of that, the globe as a whole is diversifying away from oil and petrochemicals. And the reality is other countries like China in particular, and some countries in Asia and Europe are more dependent on Middle Eastern oil than US. And so even though it's an integrated market, and even though oil still matters, it doesn't matter as much. But what does matter, I think, a great deal is also preserving international trade. And here are the key choke points of the Suez Canal and the Bab el-Mandeb, which connect Asia and Europe, are absolutely critical. And so preserving freedom of navigation isn't just about oil. It really is just about trade and sea lanes. Two other interests that I didn't really mention that I think just are less significant, but are often justifications for American involvement in the Middle East. First is the focus on Israel's security. And obviously Israel is a close partner of the United States that we care deeply about. But Israel is also much more powerful than it used to be. It has become a regional military and economic powerhouse. So frankly, it needs the U.S. less. I'm not sure this climbs up to these three levels of interest. The other is, great power competition with Russia and China in the Middle East. And here, this can't be a justification for endlessly dumping weapons or, investment into the region to compete with Russia and China. And some Russian and Chinese involvement is just fine. And I think what we need to do is just kind of look at the different things the Russians and Chinese are doing in the region and decide on a case-by-case basis where something is a problem for our interests and what kind of response is necessary versus one that isn't, as opposed to creating this broad umbrella in a region to invest heavily in the region, reason to invest heavily in the region. So those are U.S. interests. The next part of understanding a strategy has to do with what is actually happening in the region. So we can go to the next slide and talk a little bit about that. And this slide is very confusing, and that's on purpose because there's a lot of messy things happening in the region. But I would say, look, the region ultimately is characterized by unusual amounts of instability and conflict. And where does that instability and conflict come from? Well, it starts with the lack of political freedom and economic opportunity that exists in the region. According to Freedom House, this is the least free region in the world. And so what you've seen as a result of that is protest movements, right? You had obviously the so-called Arab Spring in 2011, or the Arab uprisings with Egypt, Syria, Tunisia, Libya, Yemen, Bahrain, protests elsewhere. But it's not as though those have gone away. We had a resurgence again of protests in 2019 in places like Algeria, Sudan, Lebanon, and Iraq, because again of poor governance at the ultimate and dissatisfaction from the population. So this problem sets ultimately a condition which then creates all the other challenges in the region. Now in some of these cases, as in Libya, Yemen, Syria, and Iraq, these challenges actually like escalate into civil war. In the case of Iraq, it was actually an American intervention that started it. In Syria, Yemen, and Libya, it was the very forceful responses from different parts of the government in response to protests that started it. But the reality is, this instability is one of the things that creates opportunities for like terrorist organizations to organize, or extremist groups to organize, and potentially threaten the United States. So there is this direct tie between lack of freedom and opportunity in the region and our interests, and our core interests. The second major factor in these conflicts and in the region overall is very intense state-on-state competition. And that's what you see with all these different lines from different countries intervening in each other's affairs. You basically have almost 4 different groupings in the Middle East at this point. You have Iran, you then have Saudi Arabia, UAE, and some of the other sort of conservative Arab states. You've got Turkey and Qatar, who are more open to working with Islamist groups. And then you have Israel. And all these states are competing with each other in the region. And so whenever a place starts to get unstable, all of them are worried about losing influence and also see opportunities to compete with others. And so they all start dumping money and weapons into these different unstable places. And that turns these small civil wars into big, ugly civil wars. And there's a lot of history and research done on one of the biggest factors in terms of the ugliness and length of civil wars has to do with external intervention, and that as they increasingly become international proxy wars. And so this state-on-state competition then fuels these conflicts, which again creates this threat to the U.S. in terms of terrorism. It also, is a core explanation for why we're so worried about nuclear weapons in the region. Is all these states competing with each other in their security competition, which then leads to nuclear competition. So these two factors, right, lack of freedom and opportunity for the people of the region and intense state-on-state competition, are really at the center of all the things that challenge U.S. interests in the region. And yet our policy over the past 20 years has been to make all these things worse. Rather than address the poor governance problems and the lack of freedom, we pretty much enable authoritarian governance and invest heavily in relationships with these governments. We take sides in all these conflicts and interfere. Again, in Iraq, we started it ourselves. In Libya, we overthrew Gaddafi and then we kind of got out of the way. In Syria, we didn't intervene to get rid of Bashar al-Assad, but we did just enough to support the opposition to actually just prolong the conflict. We're just making these things worse in all these cases with our interventions by trying to shape the outcome instead of just end these conflicts. And the other thing we do is just sell a lot of weapons into the region, which is not necessarily what you want to do if you're trying to reduce state-on-state competition. This is just going to make it worse. And so you put all those things together, and American policy, I believe, in the last 20 years has largely been working against America's core interests. And so what do we do differently? So this is what we propose here at CNAS and what our program has been working on for, really the last year. A new U.S. strategy for the Middle East, which has 3 pieces to it. First, pursue a de-escalatory diplomatic strategy to end wars instead of winning them. The biggest threat to U.S. interests coming out of these civil wars is not that this leader wins or that leader wins or this group affiliated with that country wins. It's that the conflicts keep going and all the bad things that come out of the conflicts, especially terrorist attacks, mass migration flows, humanitarian catastrophes, are the biggest problems that we face coming out of these conflicts. And so our strategy needs to be first and foremost based on ending them, not ending them in a way that works best for our supposed interests, but actually just drags the conflict on. Second, pursue a people-first U.S. assistance and economic strategy. And we'll talk in more detail about this. We actually just released a paper today on precisely this topic with my colleagues, Kayleigh Thomas, Daphne McCarty, and Sydney Scarlata, and that dives deeper into what a more sensible U.S. assistance and economic strategy should look like. But I should just say that, look, when the U.S. has been most effective in the world, we've led with diplomacy and we've led with our economic model and our governance model, and we've underwritten it with our security investments. And that's what we've done in places like Europe and Asia and the Indo-Pacific, where we've been successful. In the Middle East, we really just lead with the military, constantly using that tool, and we don't really move as far on these other tools of American national power that are frankly much more important, and much more effective, and where our real advantages lie. And so putting more of an emphasis on that. And third is reducing U.S. conventional military presence in the region. we need to get out of the addiction of throwing aircraft carriers into the Middle East and carrier strike groups. I mean, this has less to do with the region and more to do with our overall global posture and our focus on other challenges as well and maintaining the readiness of the force. But the bottom line is I believe we can still protect our bottom line interests in the region while reducing our force presence. Doesn't mean going to zero. It just means reducing, right? Again, we're not going to do the yo-yo diet. We're going to try to find that healthy, sustainable balance. So let's then dive deeper into these three different lines of effort. First, pursuing de-escalatory diplomacy. So what does that actually look like? I think right now it has to start with dealing with the challenges posed by Iran. The Biden administration is engaging right now in negotiations in Vienna with the other members of the P5+1 to return to the JCPOA with Iran. We'll see if that actually happens or not. The results have been somewhat mixed so far. Really the decision is in Iran's court at this point. And I think we'll know in the next few months how they plan to pursue. But the key is, and Jake Sullivan has described this as first you want to put the nuclear program back in the box. Because again, going back to our interests, it's probably the most critical. But then you really want to use it to build on that, to pursue broader de-escalatory diplomacy in the region. That means encouraging the Gulf states to engage with Iran, which has started happening now. Saudi Arabia is engaging in talks with Iran. The UAE is. And part of the reason that's happening is their own interests, but also it's mattered that the U.S. has been signaling them that this is something that we would like to see. And they pay attention to that because especially the Saudis have been nervous about their standing in Washington, and if they in a new Democratic administration, and if they can demonstrate that they're a constructive player, like that will help them. There's a lot of opportunities for areas. We wrote a report about a year ago on like where you might take that regional dialogue. It could involve naval de-escalation. It could involve ways to reduce interference in each other's affairs. Iran stopped supporting actors inside Eastern Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia stopped supporting some actors inside of Iran. We can talk about COVID-19, the environment, which is a major issue in the Middle East with the challenges posed by global warming. And yes, it also means talking about issues like Yemen and Syria and ending some of these other regional conflicts with all these countries are involved. And so that's like, I think, one part of the escalatory diplomacy. A couple of other observations here. When it comes to wars like Syria and Yemen, I think, again, let's go back to the point of we need to end these conflicts first and foremost for the sake of the people there and for our own interest. And so we need to have realistic approaches. And I think the Biden administration is still reviewing its Syria policy. But for a long time, our Syria policy has been, we're going to use sanctions to get rid of Bashar al-Assad, and then we'll figure things out. So a guy who basically killed 500,000 of his own people in a brutal years-long civil war is suddenly going to give up because of sanctions and, with withholding of reconstruction aid. And until he does, we're not going to engage with him or his government in any way or do anything. To me, that doesn't make a lot of sense. I think we just need to figure out what a realistic outcome for Syria is that might involve him staying, at least for some period of time, as detestable and unpleasant as it is. And as much as that man belongs in The Hague on war crimes trials, like this is, I think, the world we're faced in. And I also think similarly in Yemen, we just need to take a very realistic approach about what is possible, given the fact that the Houthis control half of the country. Again, the objective needs to be how do we most effectively end this war and the humanitarian crisis, not necessarily how do we, reshape things so that like all of Yemen can be reunited, because we'd like to see that, even though it seems very unlikely based on the situation on the ground. Finally, what does de-escalatory diplomacy mean? Just going back to the previous slide, when it comes to Israel-Palestine, I think there's no real prospect yet for a two-state solution, at least at the moment. But I think there's a lot of work that can be done on engaging behind the scenes, especially with the new Israeli government, to try and make slow progress to basically improve, prosperity, opportunities, security, and rights basically for both Israelis and Palestinians. Improve the situation on the ground, work on rebuilding Gaza, work on looking for more sustainable political arrangements inside, to reunify Palestinians, and eventually like move back towards two-state negotiations when an opportunity presents itself. But I think that's where the U.S. needs to go, and we outlined again that in a pretty comprehensive way in our report we put out back in December. So that's the escalatory diplomacy. On assistance and sort of rethinking U.S. assistance. So a few key observations from our report today, and you can go read the entire report online at People First U.S. U.S. assistance strategy for the Middle East. First of all, our assistance mix is completely off balance in the Middle East. We invest so heavily in security assistance while economic governance and humanitarian gets so much less attention, even though in many ways it's more important. So our first recommendation is shift away from this heavy emphasis on military assistance, because at the end of the day, it's the underlying problems in the region are about opportunity and freedom for people, better governance and lack of corruption. And so another key recommendation is a lot of times when we do economic assistance and government assistance, it's first and foremost, and this is especially true in this region, about building a better relationship with the host country that's receiving the money, as opposed to actually focusing on outcomes. So if you want to build a better relationship with Egypt or Jordan by providing them with economic assistance to a monarchy and to basically a military-run authoritarian government, that's not going to get you, outcomes that you want, right? And so it's not as though the U.S. can do this by itself. This requires a regional approach. This requires the people of the region. It requires slow reforms in the form of the government. I think as we've all learned, the U.S. can't do this militarily, but we need to be part of looking for a long-term approach here instead of just kind of continuing to engage with the governments as they exist. And then just one other point here that I think is pretty essential. Like, it doesn't mean security assistance goes away. But I think our security assistance really needs to be focused on training small elite forces that are good at doing counterterrorism, because that's what we need most. So groups like, the Iraqi counterterrorism forces, which were critical in countering ISIS, or the Lebanese Maghawir, or Emirati presidential guard. These small forces that can actually do on the ground countering irregular warfare operations. What we don't need to be doing is selling lots of big fancy airplanes and tanks into the region, which really just are sort of prestige investments, but don't actually, help our interests. And if anything, just increase the security dilemma in the region and increase competition. So that's, I think, should be our focus in terms of secure assistance. Now, third, and this is the third part of the strategy and the final part of the strategy, is reducing our military posture in the Middle East. So next slide, please. And here, if we could just go to the next slide. So a few observations again, and we're going to have a report coming out on this in the months ahead. First, just a reminder, not every low-end threat requires an aircraft carrier or a B-52, okay? So we had last year Iranian sort of supported militia groups in Iraq launching rockets at U.S. forces on bases in Iraq. And our response was to put an aircraft carrier or carrier strike group into the region, or at least to publicize it as a way to deter, or fly B-52s and very loudly and proudly proclaim we were doing that. One, I don't think that these groups really care about that kind of message. Two, the costs are just way out of whack with what we're trying to, with the threat. And so, we really need to think more about deterrence and what kind of deterrence actually works. The other thing we really need to rethink is, one of the major drivers of our posture in the Middle East is Iran and the possibility of contingency with Iran. And the way it goes is this, the thinking is, we need to be ready to destroy Iran's nuclear program. And I think that's true. We have to hold Iran's nuclear program at threat and be ready to do that. However, what then happens is the argument then goes is if we attack Iran's nuclear program, they're going to respond with their proxies, with their missiles, in the naval arena. And so then we have to be prepared for all those things, and we have to absolutely get the region, postured in that way. And that to me doesn't make a lot of sense for two reasons. One is, look, it's not clear what the Iranian response will be. I mean, after the killing of Qasem Soleimani, which you can argue was probably even more provocative than just going after the nuclear program, the response was still somewhat, contained and restrained. And second, we have to be willing to accept some risk, right? That's, I think, the key to all this. So I would argue accept more risk, and be ready for multiple different kinds of responses. So look, I think in the region, ultimately what we need is the capacity to do counterterrorism, which means, special operations on the ground and some supporting ISR and air power, some deterrent against Iran, both in terms of naval capacity, to keep, freedom of navigation and to be able to hold the nuclear program at risk. And that's kind of enough. It's not zero, but it's significantly less than where we are now. So anyway, I will just close by saying that fundamentally what we need is an approach that is more about diplomacy with modest objectives. It's about shifting engagement away from military and towards economic and governance assistance. And it's about more modest U.S. force and a willingness to accept some risk. And if we can do those things, we can have an entirely manageable strategy for the Middle East, which can allow us to finally have that healthy approach. And if we do, then we can focus on all the other things that we've spent this entire conference talking about that, frankly, in many ways are more important, but often get lost when we get distracted by this very challenging region. So with that, I'm going to close. And I think what we're going to see next is our next session, which is the Quad equation, how 4 democracies can uphold rules-based international order in the Indo-Pacific. And that's going to be moderated by Lisa Curtis, who's the director of our Indo-Pacific Security Program here at CNAS. This is not a live event, but something that was taped just earlier today because of different time zones. So I will defer to others as we transition off to that program. And thanks for joining me and spending time with us today.